Hello and welcome to Thursday Night Talk. This is a show where we discuss the week in Humboldt, the local issues and the local personalities. I'm Talvi and I'll be your local host for the next hour. Our topic this week is what else? The planned drag show, or what was a planned drag show, fundraiser in Ferndale that was canceled over concerns of an extremist backlash after a conservative church in town posted a warning message about the event on its public-facing sign, as well as the larger question of the politicization of transphobia. Are the extremists winning? Who are the extremists? Is the intolerance merely a team-building effort? What does this intolerance say about professed followers of Jesus? What, if anything, can be done in the face of unspecified threats, whether they be violent or otherwise? We've got an amazing panel tonight joining us. We have got Loren Canon, who specializes in trans theory, feminist ethics, applied ethics, ethical theory, and meta-ethics. Loren teaches a course on trans lives and theory, also at Cal Poly Humboldt, and has recently published a book entitled The Politicization of Trans Identity, an analysis of backlash, scapegoating, and dog whistling from Obergefell to Bostock. We've got Maxwell Schnurer, who teaches communication and social advocacy, gender and communication, theories of communication influence, and is part of the Act to End Sexualized Violence at Cal Poly Humboldt. And of course, Sister Faun, Michael Weiss from the Eureka Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Welcome everyone to Thursday Night Talk. You're allowed to say.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much.
I am glad you are all here as well. I was looking into what was going on in Ferndale. Do any of you live in Ferndale by any chance?
No.
Well, let's start with Sister Faun, because I know you've been part of this since June. Because back in June, there was Pride Month, and there was a Pride Parade. There were signs that say, if you're hurt by the LGBTQ culture on the, it was on the St. Mark's Church board. If you were hurt by the LGBT culture, healing here, that went up. And then as an alternative, another church, I'm trying to remember the name of it, said, Jesus said all are precious in his sight. You're welcome here. Love is always the answer. But there seemed to be, we had a small segment on this show involving what seemed to be violent, angry words. Maybe that wasn't in June, but it was about a drag show. And I know you were around then, and you were also there yesterday. So maybe to those who are listening in right now and not exactly sure what's going on, because there's a lot of information flying around, can you just explain from your perspective what you've seen happening within Ferndale in particular?
So, of course, there are a lot of people involved, and I might not have all the information, but what I do understand is that there's a new organization in Ferndale called Lost Coast Pride, and they've been working towards really bringing a voice to people, LGBTQ people in the Ferndale area. And they've been doing some great work. And when they started their Pride in June, I believe that's when we started seeing some the signs from St. Mark's start to show anti-LGBT comments about Pride being sinful, and it's continued over the year. And what recently is happening right now is the Lost Coast Pride actually planned a drag show, an all ages drag show in Ferndale, and the church posted some signs that really were about warnings to the community that this drag show is coming to town and you need to protect your kids. And then there was a lot of backlash to the owners of the venue. They stated in a couple interviews that they were threatened, their family was threatened. So they, in one interview, stated that this didn't feel like a safe space for their family. So they canceled the drag show.
Do you know who, I mean, I assume they wouldn't want to tell anybody who threatened them, but was it specifically people from that church? Or?
I don't know all the details. Yeah, it was my understanding that they were getting some threatening comments from supporters of the church. I don't know if they were members of the church but people that had the same views as the church at the time.
So I have a question that this is going to be one of the softballs I told you about. So whoever wants to pick it up, you can. But what is the difference between, and I might have an idea of the answer, though several people here on this panel happen to be, they study this. What is the difference between, say, a transgendered person and somebody who does drag?
Well, I think that might come over to my side, so I'll field this. Although Sister Faun can also talk about this as well. And I guess I jumped on. This is Loren, and I should mention I in your introduction, I do teach in the CRGS department, critical race, gender, and sexuality studies. But my home department is philosophy. So actually, I'm a philosopher at Cal Poly Humboldt, but did develop that course as you mentioned. So I guess I just jumped on this partly because this is something I do study and it's something I live. So I am a transgender person. I'm a trans man, and there's a lot of overlap, and there's also distinctions as well. And I think that's why sometimes it gets kind of confusing. And so, when I present myself as I know myself to be, I'm not being artistic. As if you could see me, I know it's radio. If you could see me, I'm not artistic in my presentation. This is not an art form. I'm presenting myself as I know myself to be, and trans people and gender non-binary people across the country and across the world are similar. And this isn't to say that we can't be expressive and beautiful with our expressions and our presentations, whatever they are. I happen not to be. I take, and Sister Faun can maybe chime in, but as a long fan of drag, that I see that as an art form in both ways. I mean, transgender people, we're seen as kind of challenging the gender binary assumptions of our culture. That certainly is true. And I think people who are active in drag also are kind of challenging those gender binary constructions that we have in culture. But I think there is a difference with regards to something which is more focused on a performance and something which is, Wednesday. but I'll kick it to Sister Faun, and maybe the other side can be discussed a bit more.
So thank you, Loren. Drag, I mean, it's performance art, and it has been around for generations and centuries and thousands of years. In people that might be familiar with, theater, in the past where most famous is Shakespearean theater. Back then, women were not allowed to be in theater, so men played the role of women. But as drag has evolved over time, and in modern times, it is very comedic. It can be comedic. It can be performance art, but it also, examples. I mean, cartoons from the 60s and 70s, Bugs Bunny dressing in drag. And modern day movies like Mrs. Doubtfire and Medea, and even back in the 60s, Some Like It Hot with Marilyn Monroe. So drag is performance, and of course anybody can do drag, so there can be crossover with any community. And one thing within the LGBT community is drag often is a pushback on the community norms of gender roles, and really challenges that we are expected to dress and look a certain way. And so this drag can push back on that and really challenge those views.
That was one thing I wanted to ask. Has this church spoken out against burlesque? Because I know there have been burlesque performances in the area, and I'm not sure if they were all ages, but I don't see why they wouldn't be, depending on the type of show that was being done. And so I'm wondering, is this church upset at burlesque just the same that they are at drag?
I have not heard them say anything to that effect.
Maxwell?
I sort of doubt it. I don't get the feeling that consistency of values is at the heart of this moment. I sort of think that the conversation is more about really targeted and I think discriminatory arguments against gay, trans, and drag performances. And I think it's part of a national continuum at this point of larger threads that are being fed by some of our national leaders who are repeating really just fictional arguments, bad arguments, and dishonest arguments about our community members, our family members, our friends, and us. And I think that that's at the heart of it. I mean, 141 threats to drag shows in 2022, according to GLAAD. The Pulse nightclub shooting, the Colorado Springs shooting. I mean, these are not theoretical or hypothetical moments that are associated with value peace. These are attempts to terrorize communities in order to silence. And I think, as has been pointed to by Sister Faun and by Dr. Canon, push for gender conformity by virtue of violence and threats, I think.
Mm-hmm. If I could support my colleague a little bit in terms of the international nature of this, and we can't reduce like a national and global phenomenon to one or two things. It's way too complex than that. But I think Professor Schnurer is right. Is that like what is, all of the, and this was some of my motivation for my book, all the anti-transgender legislation, the increase in trans violence, now the increase in violence and threats against drag shows. I mean, the one common piece that we can see is that it is attacking any variation of what I mentioned before, like this very binary gender sex binary, that a person is born, they're identified as a particular sex based on a quick glance at genitalia, and then all these other assumptions about that person are set in stone in this kind of gender binary kind of way. So if a person's identified as a male kind of person, they need to grow up heterosexual, they need to display a certain kind of masculinity in public, maybe they like to have certain pastimes, maybe even certain tastes, and then perform certain kind of social roles. And so all of what we see here is so much of this seems to be folks feeling that they can't live, that without this strict gender binary in place, that does so much havoc to so many people. Without that in place, their world will fall apart, And Maxwell or Schnurer was so correct too in terms internationally. I think it's noteworthy we recently had the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. I was watching that day, it happens to be my birthday, and I was watching Don Jr. get the crowd kind of riled up. And lo and behold, who does he start demonize but trans women? Like, wow, trans people are so popular a scapegoat, they're ending up on Don Jr.'s lips before the insurgency. Similarly, the new kind of right-wing prime minister of Italy has spoken the same things against against transgender people. So has Putin of Russia. So like when we see like how this kind of is a contagion across so much of our world, and what that means is that makes so many people vulnerable to this kind of mimetic actions, meaning like mimicking actions of other people that put people at real harm's way.
So I want to ask, because I can't imagine the population of transgendered individuals, even within the United States, is very high. There's a small percentage of people who are LGBTQ. It's a lot more than people think. People think that the numbers are rising, but it's just actually becoming more acceptable to say if somebody is, that they are part of that group. Though, is anybody aware of the numbers of like, I mean, I hate to say it, but when I think about if somebody says, oh, a school was shot up, immediately who comes to mind in my mind is a white male. Must have done that. Is there a reason to hate upon or to assume that a transgendered individual would cause harm because there's been a pattern of transgendered individuals who have done so?
Can I answer this?
Yes, please.
So firstly, there's not very many trans people. So one estimate is 1.6 million in the U.S. identify as trans. That's not very many people. And I'm thinking, what you said reminded me of the anti-transgender bathroom bills that started being popularly proposed right after the same-sex marriage ruling in 2015. That was the Obergefell ruling in 2015. And then all these bills started popping up, some of them against folks using bathrooms and locker rooms. And when you look at the advertisements, for people to pass these laws and the rhetoric, it all is demonizing trans people, that we're very dangerous and that your young daughters are at risk. And it's really quite something if you look at it. I mean, I like scary monster movies from the 70s, and it's basically the same kind of music. But what is the fact of the matter is that trans people are not hassling anyone in bathrooms, right? There is no evidence that trans people or gender non-binary people are hassling anyone in a bathroom or in a locker room. In fact, what we have evidence of is that there are folks who are gender non-conforming who are being hassled in bathrooms to the extent of having post-traumatic stress disorder. I can say that I have stories, as most trans people have stories, about real cause for harm, emotional and otherwise. We have statistics that folks who are gender non-conforming, whether they identify as trans or not, we're more susceptible to things like urinary tract infections because being in those gendered places is simply not safe. And so we don't go. And then what happens is that then this has like physical, besides the stress and the being yelled at and pushed and all that else. I mean, like this has physical ramifications. But so to your answer, no, trans people, we're just trying to live our lives, right? We're just trying to live our lives and use the restroom when we need to. But what we do see when there are people who are scapegoated, they tend to be a small minority of people. You don't want to scapegoat a large number of people. That's just simply not going to work. You scapegoat a small number of people for whom you can write a story about that is particularly conducive to getting other people to be afraid of them.
Thank you, Dr. Canon. We are going to continue this discussion after a very quick break. So hang tight. right, everyone, and welcome back to Thursday Night Talk. I am your local host, Talvi Fried. I am here with Professor Schnurer, Dr. Canon, and Mr. Faun. I feel like those are the names we're going by. Awesome. And we are discussing, well, it started with the issues, and I call it an issue because it feels like a community issue, with conflicts between one particular church in Ferndale and the community around them. I feel like personally that the world is being more open in a lot of ways. Maybe not, there have been times in history where things were as open, though I feel like the openness is causing a pushback from certain fundamentalist Christian groups who have their views and opinions. And in this time and age, people who are part of LGBTQ, who have been terrorized for centuries in some cases, in some places around the world, they've also been exalted and held to as high positions in other places around the world, interestingly enough. We don't have to get into the history of that because there's so much to cover. And we discussed, because I have to ask, why are people who are transgendered or LGBTQ hated? So thank you, Dr. Canon, for discussing that. There's no real reason, well, except that there is. I want to go to Professor Schnurer, because you had mentioned earlier, it's defying gender norms that really upsets people. And I want to look a little bit into why you think that is, and why would it upset somebody if someone who was born one way, which I feel like we should get into the biological nature of what gender is, but we'll do that after this one question, which is, why are people so upset when somebody doesn't qualify as what somebody thinks they should be?
Well, I think, I'd love to answer this and maybe bridge back to Sister Faun to ask about the take of this, as I think drag is kind of revolutionary potential to disrupt some of the norms. And part of the reason why it's such an electric issue in Ferndale, I think, is associated with the degree to which it's meaningful and potentially transformative and challenging some of the stable assumptions that Dr. Canon was speaking about and you're asking about, Talvi. I do think that at the heart of this is not a matter of trans folk, but a matter of hatred. And as someone who's lived here for now 18 years and loves this community, I believe many folks are welcoming, inclusive, and hoping to have the kind of space that would allow young, queer, gender questioning, and trans youth to have access to all the information they need to fully develop. Some of the pressures Dr. Canon's talking about, including health and well-being, but mental health, suicide ideation. We know that the harm is not that queer people hurt kids. That is just factually not true statistically. National Institutes of Health, FBI, all of the evidence we know knows that there's no, the sort of often made lie that queer folks harm kids is just factually not true. But what we do know is that discrimination and bias against queer folks, especially queer youth, is incredibly devastating to folks at some of the most fragile points of their development. And I think drag shows, especially all ages drag shows, are incredibly important in a community that wants to welcome and have its kids be healthy and, connected to a community that provides space. And so the answer to your question, I think, why would this be so angering? I think a lot of it is tied to the assumptions about masculinity and femininity, the stories that we're told, and the ideas of expectations. You had talked a little bit about large-scale shootings, and I would say that masculinity is a humongous problem with the expectations of gun violence and violence as a solution to problems. I hesitate to pass it over with a big question to Sister Faun, but is it possible that drag and challenging some of the stories might be part of the solution to challenging some of these stories about masculinity? Is there something here that, is potentially positive or transformative?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because, what we know is that decades of studies have shown that religious-based family rejection has contributed to high rates of depression, suicide ideation for youth, for LGBTQ youth. And, I also wanted to make a point that you mentioned, that this is a religious obsurgence, but I want to clarify that there are so many denominations in Christianity, and there are so many opening and affirming churches of all religions, and that this trend that's happening across the country right now there are pieces of it that are extreme religious based, and there are pieces that are probably politically motivated. With regards to this particular church in Ferndale, I did some research, and the minister actually has a YouTube channel, and he has a lot of videos where he's talking about the LGBT community, and it's not just drag or trans identity, but just the concept of somebody who is with the LGBTQ on any level is breaking the gender norms for them. And on his video, one of the things he said was that people who commit homosexual acts deserve to die. That's really serious. And when we were at the Ferndale City Council meeting last night, they were standing up and saying that we don't hate anybody, that we're just saying our beliefs, and of course we all have our First Amendment right. That said, when language gets to a point where it is it can infuse violence, what's not legal is you can't, example that was given last night is you can't yell fire in a theater when there's not a fire. That's illegal. So I think a lot of the fear in our community is that we don't trust that language isn't going to escalate into action, and because it has so many times. And so there's a legitimate fear in the LGBTQ community when you have an organization that their core belief is that our relationships are misaligned with their God. So it's challenging for them, and we threaten their belief system.
When facing somebody who threatens you, and this goes out to anybody who has felt threatened, which even I have felt threatened by certain people in life, and I'm a very tall woman, and I think that just intimidates people a lot. And so I'm used to it, though. I became really strong. It's the way I deal with things. Though to have people don't have a reason to really hate me. I'm white presenting, woman, decently capable of speaking my mind and diffusing situations. What can somebody do when they're being confronted or being it's almost like I feel like this shouldn't be on somebody who's being attacked. They just shouldn't be attacked. They shouldn't be harassed. But if they are, and this comes to mind because a friend of mine was walking through Arcata and they took a video of a person, they happened to be a transgender individual, and this person said horrific things to them and got physically violent with them. And this group of gals walked by and said, tried to step in to help. My friend said, please back away and leave me alone to deal with this. And then that group of gals was like, well, see, this is why we don't help, you know, trans people, blah, blah, blah. Like, you don't want our help anyway. And it's like, well, that's a savior complex there that is unnecessary. Though what is like, I'm not sure what can be done if, say, this church suddenly shows up, and I'm not just saying it's this church, but it seems like this church is being very advocating for themselves as, we will not tolerate this, and we think that violence is okay, is what they seem to be saying. And what are people who are LGBTQ or transgendered or just an ally, what is to be done in order, because I always, my answer is always like, let's diffuse the situation and let me go like lick my lollipop while dancing on sunshine and try to like live a happy life. But I also realize that that's not the reality. Not everyone can do that. And so what can be done?
Professor Schnurer, I'm going to lob this over to you because I think that you're going to have some really good answers for it.
Well, it's tough. I was waiting for Dr. Canon, for those answers. And Loren and I spend a fair amount of time working together and collaborating, and so we have a joy in listening to each other. I honestly, I just appreciate the kind of complex layered question. And let me say first, I guess, which is that I think at the heart is that I think this is a community matter. And I almost would flip the argument that is often made by conservatives, what about the children? I think solidarity means sharing risk. And I think in this space, we're not looking at a particular moment that's just hateful towards some folks, and we might not care about that. I think this should be an activating issue for everyone with a heart and a brain in this community, because it targets some vital resources for our kids. We should feel the same way about the silencing of this drag show that we would feel about the vandalizing of a library or the damage to a mental health facility, which is that this is an intentional effort to harm those who are doing incredibly good work in our community for our kids. And so I think at the heart, I think is a certain amount of willingness to share space. I also think it's worth drag performers, trans and queer folks getting the microphone first on some of these issues. And I think that's maybe number two. And maybe number three, I think, and again, Talvi, you asked this incredibly layered, complex question, and there are elements that I bet all three of us could kind of dive into. But I do think it's worth us challenging and contesting these logics whenever they come up in our friends and families and workplaces and networks. And I think it's vital for us to ask really hard questions, to make our values evident in the spaces. Some folks who get privilege, as you and I have mentioned, I think all of us at various points, we might get access to communities who will let loose discriminatory comments about drag shows, jokes about trans individuals, and our willingness to share risk by disrupting those spaces, by letting folks know that that's not okay in our space, I think is a certain amount of what we can do. I also think it's worth coming back to some of the ways Sister Faun introduced this, to think a little bit about the incredible potential of drag and the ways that it's tied into so many parts of our lives. Halloween, when we're talking to friends and family members who are talking about this likelihood that someone saying something hateful has, is a guy who is dressed in a dress at some point, is a very strong possibility, or knows something about that thread. Is it possible with some questioning, some caring engagement, you might ask, is there something that says that we would love a more broad gender expression, and many of us feel limited in the ways that we're policed on a regular basis? And is it possible to find some common ground there? So those are my three thoughts, which is just, solidarity means a certain amount of risk. Trans, queer, and drag performers should get the microphone first to talk about this. Protecting our kids means protecting drag shows for all ages. And I think it's willing that we all need to kind of dive into those tough conversations with the conservative relatives and friends and coworkers we have.
And maybe, thank you. And I also think, so I don't think there's, I guess it's obvious. Maybe there's no one thing that one can do to keep oneself safe. I mean, we have a nation in which so many people have never had any ability to feel safe, right? And so much of the anti-trans violence is particularly against people of color and against women of color, and so we kind of can't, right? But even to your example, if something looked kind of scary and somebody looked like they might, be vulnerable to harm, and if somebody offers to help out and the person says no, I mean that doesn't mean that one should never help out again. I mean, this is so personal. And this, like, what was going through that person's, mind at that time? Have they been helped and it got worse before? I mean, I guess the whole thing, kind of working on what Professor Schnurer said, is about solidarity, and I would kind of want to flip it too, in terms of, that if I, as a trans person was talking, to someone who, had some of these beliefs in terms of my identity was illegitimate, or evil, or somehow horrible for children. I really love children. I would want to, perhaps naively, want to say, like, I would want to, like, visit. Can we visit? Can we talk to each other? Because we as human beings and the common vulnerabilities we have so much more in common than we have. That's different. And what I think has happened is, when you politicize and you scapegoat one group of individuals, what happens is that people become less and less open-minded. They start having, like, what they think are very sure ideas about who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. And solidarity with us, and us are defined as those who are not them, those bad guys. And I think that's the political culture we're in across the country, and also even in our little towns here on the North Coast. I have been targeted recently with my pride flag being torn down at work. That was kind of odd. And I've been recently targeted by an ultra-right group as a problematic professor, basically only because I wrote a book about the politicization of trans identity, which, if you look at the news, can't be denied. Whether you think it's a good thing that identity is politicized, that's one thing. But this targeting happens. And I would like to ask those who are doing it to ask, like, what is keeping you from seeing the humanity of individuals? What's keeping you from hearing our stories about our lives, and how listening to those stories is a form of respect, even in our small North Coast communities?
I think it's interesting that people talk about respect. And the one thing that I know that most American Christians agree on, and especially right-wing people who follow right-wing politics seem to agree on, is that they respect their vets. The person who started, is it Redwood Pride or Ferndale Pride? They are a veteran. They did serve in the military. So I just want to put that out there for anybody being like, well, but because I don't think people create these monsters in their heads that they're told to believe in since they're children. And a lot of people have never been out in the world, or, because their families or whatever situation they're in just hasn't allowed them to understand that nobody is one person. Everybody is everything they've ever done and known and everything like that. So I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was interesting. So for anybody who is like, how do you automatically hate a veteran if that's, I believe that he might, or they might be Christian as well. It's like, wait a minute, like it's confusing to me. how you can hate somebody that just because you think something. We are going to be taking a quick break. When we get back, I would appreciate if Sister Faun could touch upon that topic and we can continue it a little bit. And I'll see you right back here on KZZH. Welcome back, everyone. This is Thursday Night Talk. I am your local host, Talvi Freed. I'm able to say my own name. We are here with Professor Schnurer, Dr. Canon, as well as Sister Faun. And we left off with a rather involved question that I threw at everybody. And it did have multiple layers. Your Professor Schnurer is right. Though it was, how do you protect somebody? How do you show respect to people who are adversaries in a way? Because sometimes I have to think in my head, what is my choice today? When somebody comes at me a certain way, and I have to think, am I gonna, I don't ever want to be separated from my dog. So I go, okay, let me see how I can diffuse the situation. Let me see how I can come to a compromise, because this is a very local show. This is about people who live here, personalities, etc. And whether anybody likes it or not, people who are LGBTQ are going to be in this environment. People who are transgendered are going to be in Humboldt County. People who are right-wing extremist Christian are going to live in Humboldt County, work in Humboldt County. And so I guess my question was, what do you do? I mean, I almost feel like from both sides. What do you do when you feel threatened? Because I almost feel like that particular church somehow feels really threatened. And so, Sister Faun, wanted to hear from you.
So I really appreciate what Dr. Canon said about having spaces to talk with each other, and really, we have so many intersecting identities. And yes, Papa K, who is the founder of Las Cosas Pride, is a vet, and when I think about last night was my first experience in person in front of people from the congregation, and I have to say, there are some people there that probably would not have been open to a conversation. And after I spoke, there was a woman from the congregation who came up to me and shook my hand and said, I know it's really hard to get up there and speak, and I appreciate you speaking and saying your perspective. And we had a moment. And so, I think there are moments where we can connect and talk about, who we are and share our experiences. We might not, it's not necessarily about changing people's opinions on, their core belief, but maybe it's about building respect for another human being and their experience, so I think there's always opportunities to have conversations with some people, and with some people there's not those opportunities, and we always are cautious on where those intersect.
So I wanted to give a little bit of time, because we've only got 17 minutes to go till the end of the show. It keeps being brought up, what is good for the children, the youth, et cetera, and one of the big call outs from the St. Mark's Church was, won't somebody think of the children? And I know there's a lot of opinions on that one here. I have my own, but I will let Yes, Dr. Canon.
I think we all have opinions on this. And this is kind of related to some forms of anti-transgender legislation that have been particularly popular in the last year or so with regards to trans children. And what I think is a little bit contradictory is that in some, and I, respect respect those who have other political views than me. But in those circles that sometimes are particularly conservative, a lot of times there's a large focus on the family and recognizing that the parents are the ones who are, have kind of a sacred duty to raise their children and to make decisions for them. And then what I find in these contexts, either with regards to this legislation I mentioned before, even now, it's like, wait, what about the parents? That the all ages drag shows are not required. Nobody has to go. If you don't think your child will like it, you are welcome to do whatever you want to do with your child, right? With regards to supporting youth in terms of their own health, if it's related to being trans or not. Let's listen to the parents again. Let's listen to the American Medical Association. Let's listen to the American Psychological Association, right? I mean, what I think is weird is that what about the children? It's like, gee, can we trust the parents? If the parents want their kid to see it, I wish I would have seen a drag show when I was a kid. I had to wait till 30 years old. If the parents want the children to go to an all ages drag show, then go. And if you don't want to, don't go. And if you go and it's not your cup of tea, go out for ice cream, right? So I see this as it's contradictory rhetoric that that kind of shows that maybe it's not about parents' rights. It's not about parental influence. It's against a certain people. And that's the problem.
I have a feeling, and maybe this is me speaking out of turn, but I have a feeling that if that particular or churchgoers who actually believe in what that church says had a say, they would remove children from homes who went to a drag show. I have a strong feeling that that's what they think. I also have a feeling that a lot of people on the other side, what is the other side? People who are accepting of LGBTQ and not only accepting or part of that. Is that a community that's part of our community? It's a smaller subsect of a community. I have a feeling that a lot of people would remove children from homes if they were that staunch Christian too. I think that goes both ways, which again becomes who is the extremist? Because I think both sides see the other as an extremist sort of entity. Yes, Professor Schnurer.
If I could just add a little bit of support for Dr. Cannon's phenomenal insight there. I mean, I think drag at its heart is gender play that has incredibly educational possibility. It makes the space that challenges some of the stereotypes that Sister Faun was talking about earlier. And I think that's part of why it's so triggering to conservatives, which is that it sort of points to the reality that gender is not particularly stable, but is oftentimes a story handed to us that everyone chafes at various points. Secondly, I think that we just have to look again at the national statistics and the many studies which have gone, which is that children shouldn't be harmed. They should not be sexually assaulted. I co-chair the Sexual Assault Prevention Committee, and for more than 16 years have been working in this field at Cal Poly Humboldt. And I'm a reasonably well-known expert on these particular issues. Most folks who harm kids are sexually straight. Most of them are the partners of parents. And it is a problem. Children should be believed, but there is almost no evidence that, in fact, queer folks, trans folks, folks in bathrooms harm kids. Most of the folks who are harmed by someone that they know in their family, sadly. But what we also need to note kind of third is that drag is this affirming, inviting, world-opening performance. And for many of the folks who have been rejected by families, who've been told that their gender nonconforming identity, their sexuality, or themselves are not welcome in the family, drag becomes a space where people have community, care, a sense of well-being and welcome. And that's what we want for kids. And I think the whole idea of I'm not giving the church too much energy or time, because I think they're emblematic of a lot of other problems in our society, and it's worth contesting them. But at the heart, I think, is a misunderstanding of where the real harm is, and the incredible curative space that all ages drag shows can provide in a community.
Well, and the hypocrisy of it is that they're using their belief of the threat of gender norms being broken as damaging children, and yet they're not going after childhood beauty contests or any other event that is really sexualizing children, or spaces that mirror or even more extreme than what they're challenging of these situations. Because it's more about our community and the fact that we're challenging gender norms.
Dr. Canon, I wanted to give you a moment to kind of go over your book and where people can find it, because I think it does cover a lot of the topics that we've discussed here. So Dr. Loren wrote a book and published it, which is an impressive feat all on its own. It's called The Politicization of Trans Identity, an analysis of backlash, scapegoating, and dog whistling from Obergefell to Bostock. And I'll let you say the title.
Obergefell to Bostock. Right. Yeah, it is a long title. You can get the book at Amazon, or you can go right to the Rowman and Littlefield Publishers, Lexington Press, so you can find it there as well. And maybe I'll just take just a very few seconds to not recite the book, but tell the story of the book. And it was the first time that the Trans Lives in Theory class was taught at Cal Poly. I was teaching it, and it was the first time it was actually funded. So I was teaching it as a real instructor as opposed to a volunteer. I volunteered for many years, and that's when the North Carolina anti-bathroom bill came out right after the same-sex ruling. After the same-sex ruling in 2015, that's when we saw the onslaught of anti-trans directed legislation. And basically, like in my class, we talked about North Carolina, then another state, then another state, then another state, then another state, and then increased violence. And I guess as a philosopher and as an applied ethicist, I just wanted to say, what is going on? What is happening here? Trans people have been ostracized and oppressed, in this country throughout time, but not like this. So anyway, that was the motivation for the book. And I do talk a lot about backlashing, scapegoating, and how we can try to understand this phenomenon.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to get back to you. Well, I'll save you for the end then, Dr. Canon. So we're going to start our round robin. What our round robin is for all panelists, you have about 2 minutes. You can wrap this up however you want. Let's start with Sister Faun. If you have anything to say to those listening or who are watching on YouTube, now is the time.
Yeah, so this Sunday in Ferndale, the sisters are hosting what we're calling communion. It's a community affirming event and ritual in Ferndale in front of their city hall, where we're going to do a day of non-judgment, and we invite families and anybody to come out and celebrate diversity and non-judgment. And that's going to be at 10 o'clock in front of the city hall in Ferndale.
Are you scared at all? I have to ask, because I think if I were and I have to work that day. Otherwise, I feel like I just don't like violence. And I feel like with everything being said, and including, was it the old steeple that backed out, I do have to ask if are you scared at all to go and be there for something that sounds so peaceful?
Well, we're doing an event that is community supportive and uplifting. And, we're not expecting anything that's going to be violent. It's just a positive community event.
I love that. I love that. And I hope it goes really well. Professor Schnurer.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that. And I'm so enthusiastic of the space being welcomed. My thoughts are pretty, I think, succinct, I guess. I think it's worth us contesting the ideas that we find really tough with our friends, family, and coworkers wherever we have access. If somebody listens to you, I think it's worth you taking the risks to try to challenge on the side of humanity and justice. And I think when you're doing that, if you can listen to the reasons that someone else has, you can oftentimes get at the core of what they're talking about. And maybe that person is concerned for the health and well-being of kids. And you could talk about how awesome you think an all ages drag show would be for kids. And maybe y'all have some shared space of engagement there. I think it's worth us just reminding publicly and saying out loud that drag shows are not necessarily sexual. They may be educational, performative, and phenomenal for our communities, a sign of health and well-being, and are worthy of being protected. I think it's also worth repeating publicly and regularly that gay folks and trans folk don't harm kids. And finally, I think it's just worth, if possible, to provide your support by heading to a drag show near you. I think it's one of the easiest ways to maybe make this concrete is by celebrating and joyous performance, and to be an enthusiastic audience member. So I appreciate the time and space. Thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be here with these two wonderful folks as well.
Well, I appreciate you as well. Dr. Canon, did you have any final thoughts? We've got a little bit of time left.
I just want to, say a message right to my trans siblings in Humboldt County, and my gender non-binary siblings and students and LGBT folks, is that you matter, and you're seen, and you're understood by a whole lot of folks. There's a lot of stuff going on in our nation and in our county, and that has nothing to do with how valuable you are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Canon. I'd like to thank you, as well as Professor Schnurer and Sister Faun. I appreciate you so much all for being here today. That's about all the time we have. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy days and Thursday evenings to come and join me on this adventure to see to gain some insight into what's going on in Humboldt County. We'll be back next week with another Thursday night talk. If you have topics or suggestions for the show, please email me at kzzh@accesshumboldt.net. And just a reminder, the show replays on Friday evenings at 8 p.m. right here on KZZH 96.7. You can watch the show on Access Humboldt's YouTube channel, as well as our actual real TV channels. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you next week. I'm Talvi Fried, and cheers.